Imagine a group of Italian submarines traveling to the Far East with the goal of recovering strategic materials for the German war effort. It may seem strange, but it's a real story that took place during World War II, and it's also intertwined with the events following the armistice between Italy and the Allies. I will tell you about this story in a moment after the intro. If you like this and my other content, remember to subscribe and leave a like. To further support the channel, memberships are available. All the information is in the links below. The lack of certain strategic raw materials needed for the war effort was a major problem for the European Axis powers, and it became an even greater issue as the conflict dragged on. Crucial resources like natural rubber could only come from overseas territories, especially those in Southeast Asia occupied by the Japanese forces. In the early years of the war, it was possible to transfer certain quantities of these materials to Europe aboard ships that were lucky or skilled enough to break through the Allied naval blockade. They were the so-called blockade runners. These included Italian merchant ships that were caught outside the Mediterranean in 1940, but escaped capture. By late 1942, the success rate of Axis blockade runner missions had reached an historic low. And this setback pushed the Germans, in particular, to seek alternatives. The only other option seemed to be transporting these resources using submarines. This would have increased the security of the journey, but also its duration. However, there were no other viable options in sight. This solution seemed even more feasible after the successful journey to Europe of the Japanese submarine E-30, which reached Bordeaux in August 1942, as part of a resource and technology exchange mission. The submarine delivered a cargo of 650 kg of shellac and 1,500 kg of mica to Germany. This second material, for instance, was a highly required electrical isolator. The E-30 would then depart at the end of the month, arriving safely in Singapore in early October, when she would soon be sunk by a naval mine. Given this encouraging experience, the option of submarine transport gained ground. The problem was which vessels to use. The German U-boats were desperately needed for the Battle of the Atlantic, where the strength of the Allies and the use of new weapons and technologies were causing an increasingly high rate of losses. Moreover, the characteristics of most of U-boats, especially the Type 7, were not suitable for such a mission. Their range would be a problem, as would the space for carrying significant quantities of materials. The much larger and long-range Type 9 boats existed, but they do not seem to have been considered for this task. The Kriegsmarine then turned its attention to the 10 Italian submarines still available at the Betasom base in Bordeaux. The surviving Italian units, active since the end of 1940, were now suffering from the wear and tear of the long struggle in the Atlantic. Furthermore, despite the modifications made over the years, they were becoming obsolete in the face of Allied countermeasures. Therefore, in the eyes of the Germans, these units seemed expendable for such a mission to the Far East. We should also remember that the Italian boats had a very decent level of seaworthiness. They had a long range, and their internal spaces, in addition to providing better living conditions, were more suitable for transporting valuable cargo. A set of characteristics that the U-boats were severely lacking. The submarines in question were specifically the Barbarigo, Tazzoli, Da Vinci, Archimede, Finzi, Bagnolini, Cappellini, Giuliani, Torelli and Cagni. This last boat was an exception. She was a recent construction and had departed from Italy in October 1942 for a mission in the Atlantic, after which she would arrive in Bordeaux. In early February 1943, the Germans asked Captain Enzo Grossi, the commander of Betasom, to provide the construction plans of the Italian submarines based in Bordeaux. Grossi forwarded the request to Rome, which quickly made the blueprints available, with the exception of those for the Cagni. Admiral Riccardi, the Chief of Staff of the Regia Marina, had opted not to share the construction details of the most modern Italian ocean-going submarine. The Germans soon decided that the plan was feasible. After receiving approval from Hitler to proceed with the operation, the Kriegsmarine initiated further exchanges with the Betasom personnel to definitively assess the feasibility of the conversion. After receiving a positive opinion from the Italians, Admiral Dönitz wrote to his counterpart, Admiral Riccardi, on the 12th of March, asking to proceed with the modification work and make an equal number of German boats available to the Regia Marina to replace the converted units. The two admirals met shortly thereafter in Rome, and among the various issues on the table, these were in fact the final phases of the Tunisian campaign, the matter of the submarine conversion was also discussed. They decided to proceed with the transformation works in groups of 3 over the 9 subs available to Betasom, while the 10th, the Cagni, would retain her offensive role, still heading to the Far East and not ruling out her use for transporting valuable cargo. In order to reach a total of 10 transport submarines, it was considered to transfer a boat from the Mediterranean that had the appropriate size and range. The Micca, Zoea, Atropo and Mocenigo were considered, but due to various complications, this initiative was not pursued. In March, therefore, work began on the Tazzoli, Cappellini and Giuliani, which would be completed by early May. The Barbarigo, Finzi and Torelli would follow, and finally the Bagnolini, Archimede and Da Vinci. The last 2 boats, on a mission at the time when these decisions were being made, were lost in the Atlantic between April and May. The number of transport boats would thus drop to 7, with the first group of 3 units completing the modification work well ahead of the established date. This modification, necessary to improve transport capacity and range, included the removal of guns, ammunition, the cutting of torpedo tubes, the attack periscope, part of the batteries, and other equipment deemed unnecessary. It was also decided to establish a small base in Singapore to provide support for the submarines, and for this purpose additional personnel were assigned to the mission. Once they arrived at their destination, the Italian units and crews would be placed under the command of Captain Marino Iannucci, commander of the colonial sloop Eritrea, a vessel that had escaped from Italian East Africa in February 1941, when the colony was about to fall, and since then she had been operating in the Far East alongside the Japanese. The first 3 submarines were ready by May 8 and departed on their missions in the following weeks. They were to travel about 11,700 nautical miles without replenishment at sea, thanks to the large quantities of engine fuel that they carried. During the voyage to Singapore, they would transport a cargo of interest to the Japanese, while on the return voyage they would mainly load raw rubber for the Germans and carry out a refuel at sea. The Cappellini sailed on the 11th of May, carrying 95 tons of various materials for the Japanese, including spare parts for machinery, aluminium ingots, steel bars and ammunitions. The unit was so heavy that while sailing on the surface, the stern was completely submerged. To better describe the condition of the boat, I will read an excerpt from the report of the commander, Lieutenant Walter Auconi, written in 1948 about the experience of that journey. At the time of departure, I asked for and obtained permission to carry, under my responsibility, an additional fuel load in the aft ballast tank, about 16 tons, thus reaching a total of 263 tons of fuel. It should be noted that under these conditions, only the forward ballast tank and the immersion tank remained available for surfacing maneuvers, meaning that, in the first part of the journey, the submarine was navigating on the surface, with the reserve buoyancy not exceeding 3.4% of the total displacement, a condition that had never occurred for any submarine of any navy, not only in wartime, but also during peacetime exercises. It is known that German submarines, which had a lower reserve buoyancy on the surface than all other submarines in the world, never dropped below 7% of their displacement. For those of you unfamiliar with the term reserve buoyancy, think of it as a safety margin that the submarine can use to submerge, resurface, or stay afloat. The lower it is, the more complex these three actions become. Despite these initial challenges, the stern trim of the Cappellini gradually improved as fuel was consumed. However, the conditions for the men on board certainly did not. To give an idea of the extreme conditions in which the Cappellini's crew operated during those 2 months of travel, I will again quote an excerpt from Auconi's report. Far more serious difficulties for life on board were represented by the following factors. First of all, the presence of cargo in the torpedo rooms and accommodation areas, including the commander's quarters, was not only a real torment for the personnel, who were deprived of space and air, but also a real danger for all emergency maneuvers, which were located in those areas, such as manual opening of air vents, hull interceptions, switching of horizontal and vertical rudders, and their manual maneuvers. The personnel assigned to these maneuvers were forced to perform their service, vital for the safety of the boat, in very uncomfortable positions and to crawl from one point to another in the rooms, which added discomfort to the already difficult living conditions of the personnel. As if that was not enough, the presence of fuel in the ammunition depots and torpedo compensation tanks was a cause of continuous leaks with consequent toxic fumes in the rooms, which added discomfort to the already difficult living conditions of the crew. The Cappellini, however, had a rather uneventful journey and arrived safely at Sabang, at the northwestern tip of the island of Sumatra controlled by the Japanese, on the 9th of July, after a 59-day voyage. After a brief stop, she continued to Singapore, escorted by the Eritrea. The Tazzoli, under the command of Lieutenant Giuseppe Gaito, departed on the 16th of May, carrying 165 tons of materials, including special steel, mercury, ammunition, and optical and electric instruments. She also carried 4 military personnel and 5 civilians destined for the future Italian base in Singapore. On the 24th of May, the date the boat was supposed to exit the radio silence zone, no signals were received by Betasom from the Tazzoli. After fruitless searches, the boat was declared sunk, under circumstances that have never been fully clarified, but were likely due to an aerial attack. The Giuliani, under the command of Lieutenant Mario Tei, sailed on the 16th of May, but returned to Bordeaux almost immediately for an urgent repair, and departed again on the 23rd. The boat was carrying 130 tons of materials and the second contingent of personnel destined to the Singapore base. On the 17th of June, by order of Betasom, the Giuliani stood by for several hours in an area east of the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, in the hope of meeting the Tazzoli, for which, it was believed, a radio failure had occurred. The Tazzoli never arrived and the Giuliani continued the journey, arriving safely in Sabang on the 28th of July and later in Singapore. Then it was the turn of the second group, which had completed the modification work by early June. The Torelli, under the command of Lieutenant Enrico Gruppallo, departed on the 14th of June, carrying 130 tons of materials and mixed personnel. Off St. Helena, the submarine was attacked by surface units, likely trawlers, armed fishing boats equipped for anti-submarine warfare. The boat was subjected to a long hunt, which is well described in the memoirs of Primo Marzi, an officer on board the Torelli. This exhausting duel, us dodging to the right or left and them above us, pinging us with the sonar and dropping cluster of bombs, went on for more than 40 hours, almost 2 days. Under those conditions, you can't imagine how easy it is to go without food and sleep. Your mouth becomes so parched and your lips so dry that you can't even swallow a sip of water. You become automatons. Exhaustion stiffens your muscles and clouds your reason. The bombs had pushed us down to 160 meters deep. With every drop, I saw through the open watertight doors. The submarine flex like a bamboo cane. At any moment, I expected to see a valve or some hull fitting break, and a jet of water violently spray against us. Fortunately for the crew, the hunt of the enemy units was interrupted, and the Torelli was able to resume the journey. Forced to extend the route, the Torelli had to request an extraordinary refueling in the Indian Ocean. On the 12th of August, she met with U-178, one of the German boats, based in Penang, in the Far East. Sufficiently refueled, the Torelli reached Sabang on the 27th of August. The Barbarigo, under the command of Lieutenant Umberto De Julio, departed on the 16th of June, carrying 130 tons of materials and personnel for the plant based in Singapore. After the radio silence period ended, no signal was received from the Barbarigo. The unit was realistically lost between the 17th of June and the 18th, in circumstances that have never been fully clarified, likely due to an aerial attack or a naval mine. Finally, on the 29th of June, the Cagni also left Bordeaux for an offensive mission through the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, with Singapore as the final destination. The boat was under the command of Lieutenant Roselli Lorenzini. On her return voyage, this modern boat was also supposed to take on materials requested by the Germans from the Japanese. The voyages of the submarines described so far all took place during the crucial summer of 1943. When news of Mussolini's downfall arrived on the 25th of July, the Cappellini and the Eritrea were in Singapore, while the Giuliani would have arrived a few days later, and the Torelli only at the end of August. Since the arrival of the news, and despite the declaration of the new Prime Minister, Marshal Badoglio, that the war continues, the Italians in the Far East began to notice a change in the attitude of the Japanese and the Germans. This is well described by the commander of the Eritrea, Marino Iannucci, who more than anyone else had been in contact with the Axis allies far from Italy. A cooling of relations and various attempts to delay the departure of the Italian units became the norm. Iannucci also saw the thinly veiled intention of the Japanese to concentrate the Italian submarines and the Eritrea in Singapore during the final days of August. The Cappellini, the first submarine arrived in the Far East, had moved from Singapore to Sabang at the end of August to prepare for the return journey to Europe. The Giuliani in Singapore was almost ready for the return voyage too, and Commander Iannucci repeatedly urged the Japanese authorities for clearance, but without success. Finally, citing the reason of important naval operations in the area, the Japanese ordered the Cappellini to return to Singapore, and on September the 7th, Iannucci departed with the Eritrea for Sabang to escort the Italian submarine back. When the news of the armistice signed by Italy with the Allies spread, in Singapore it was the early hours of the night of the 9th of September. The crews of the Giuliani and Torelli, with the exception of a handful of guards who remained on the boats, were housed a few kilometers inland when they were reached by the news of the armistice. Days of tensions and talks with the Japanese began. Initially it seemed that they would have guaranteed internment, but then the Japanese seized the boats with force. Heated discussions began between the sailors and officers who remained in Singapore. They were essentially divided between the will to respect the orders of the king and the government and those who intended to take every opportunity, even continuing the collaboration with the Germans and the Japanese, in order to have a chance to return home. Meanwhile, the men of the Cappellini in Sabang, having received news of the armistice but unable to leave because the Japanese were blocking the harbour exit, began negotiating with their former allies. Commander Oconee managed to negotiate a sort of internment with the Japanese authorities. To this end, the Cappellini sailed again for Singapore, where she arrived on the 16th of September. Here, however, the crew was captured, and Oconee himself was beaten by the Japanese after protesting for the broken agreements. They were all put in isolation until the 24th of September, when Oconee and the entire crew of the Cappellini pledged allegiance to the newly born Italian Social Republic, the puppet government installed by the Germans in northern Italy, headed by an ill and depressed Mussolini. This choice is described in books and memoirs as being dictated by reasons of opportunity and circumstances, rather than politics or ideology. Most of the men of the Torelli and Giuliani also ended up joining the Social Republic, again driven by the desire to return home as soon as possible. To this end, the Germans made several promises to return the men home, since they eventually needed some Italians to maintain the submarine engines. 11 sailors and 17 officers remained loyal to the king and the legitimate government, and would face 2 years of Japanese prison camps. Commander Iannucci of the Eritrea had a luckier fate. He was at sea when he received news of the armistice and managed to reach British-controlled Ceylon, where he would later begin cooperating with the Royal Navy. In the Indian Ocean, Commander Roselli Lorenzini of the Cagni, upon learning the news and the consequent orders over the radio, decided to set a course for the port of Durban in South Africa, from which he would return to Taranto in January 1944. Back to the boats captured by the Japanese, they were soon handed over to the Germans, who claimed ownership based on the agreements from March 1943. Giuliani, Cappellini and Torelli were then incorporated into the Kriegsmarine, with the names, respectively, of UET 23, 24 and 25, and crewed by Germans supplemented by a small number of Italians on each boat. In February 1944, the UET 23, the former Giuliani, left Singapore, carrying a precious cargo of rubber. She had a short life, though, as she was sunk in the Strait of Malacca by the British submarine HMS Tally-Ho. During the same period, the former Cappellini also departed for France with a cargo of strategic materials: 130 tons of rubber, 60 tons of zinc ingots, 5 tons of tungsten, 2 of quinine and 2 of opium. However, the sinking of the ship that was supposed to ensure the refueling at sea forced the submarine to turn back, and she returned to Penang on the 3rd of April 1944. On the other side of the world, the Bagnolini, captured in Bordeaux by the Germans, had set sail with a German crew for the Far East, but she was sunk south of Cape Town by Allied aircraft. The other sole remaining boat in Betasom, the Finzi, was in a dire status and beyond any possible repair, and was later sabotaged when the Germans left the city. In the following months, with the Allies liberating France, the voyages of the transport submarines definitively lost their purpose. The 2 surviving boats in the Far East carried out some transport missions between Southeast Asia and Japan. As for the Italians who had not been embarked on the submarines, the majority of them remained to work at the naval base in Singapore, while others ended up joining the crews of German merchant ships that had remained in the Far East. 75 officers and sailors, however, embarked on the German ships Burgenland and Weserland on the 17th of November 1943. These 2 blockade runners were departing for France with cargoes of strategic materials. Commander Auconi, the entire staff of the Cappellini, a midshipman of the Torelli, and 26 other sailors embarked on the Burgenland. Other 37 sailors departed with the Weserland. Neither of the 2 reached their destination, as they were intercepted and sunk in southern Atlantic. Most of the Italian shipwrecked survivors were saved and finished the war in Allied prison camps. Finally, when Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Japanese took control of the 2 now worn-out Cappellini and Torelli. The 2 units were at the base of Kobe in Japan and were renamed I-503 and I-504 respectively. Only the former Torelli seems to have briefly had a mixed crew of Germans, Japanese and Italians, but the information is scarce and not very consistent. Under the new flag, in reality the 2 boats would not carry out any other missions and would be found abandoned in Kobe at the end of the war and scuttled in deep waters by the Americans the following year. After the conclusion of the war, the lucky ship Eritrea would return to the waters of the Far East to repatriate some of the Italians still missing and scattered in these areas. And thus, with the final voyage of the Eritrea, ends the story of the Italian Navy presence in the Far East during the Second World War. Well, I hope you found this mostly unknown story interesting. I really wanted to cover it on the channel, although the photo evidence is not very dense, I did my best. So, thank you for the attention and I hope to see you in the next video.